All right. Yep, looks like we have some people coming in here. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of our Merrifield Garden Center webinar series. My name is Daniel Kapp. For those of you who have been with us before, I'm not Sally Burrows. Sally is on vacation this week, and we wish her well. She should be back for our next webinar. For those people that have never seen us before, this is a Zoom webinar and not a Zoom meeting. So we cannot see you or hear you, but you will be able to ask questions in the Q&A tab, and as you can also send comments in the chat as well, that we'll be answering at the end of the webinar today. Louis is going to be doing Woodland Gardens today. And we're going to be running for about an hour. So this is going to be a little longer than most of our webinar series. So we're going to be doing an hour of Louis talking, and then we'll have 15 minutes to a half an hour after that for questions. So if you guys are not able to stay the whole time, that's fine. You are welcome to leave. We're going to have this recorded and up on our YouTube channel probably later today or earlier tomorrow, before noon. I think that is all of the housekeeping I have. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Louis Ratchford. Louis?
Hi, as Danny just said, my name is Louis Ratchford, and I work here at Merrifield over at the Ferris location. I work out in trees and shrubs, and I also do webinars, and I also do some design work in that sort of scenario. So tonight we're gonna do Woodland Gardens. It's probably one of my favorite seminars to do, and probably one of my favorite, actually, one of my favorite, I don't see, oh, here it is. There's all sorts of stuff on my screen. Let me see if I can get it off here. Let's try this again. Yeah, I just don't, so here it is. Okay, so today we're going to do the Woodland Garden. Sorry about that. I'm not that electronically savvy. So the Woodland Gardens by Louis Rashford. And the overview of what we're going to do today. First of all, we're going to do a bit of an introduction as to what Woodland Gardens are. We're going to go into some garden themes, the concepts of design. We are going to be designing a garden, a pathway, and we'll get to that. Ranges of and types of plants that you use in a woodland gardens, the concepts of a woodland garden, plant characteristics. We're going to do a brief thing on natives, the maintenance of a woodland garden, and then we're also going to do some images of woodland gardens, and we're going to go through all that. So when you look at a woodland garden, first of all, it's natural. You know, we used to live in a woods here in Virginia. And so this gets back to the basics of the woods and basically building a garden within the woods. A lot of native plants are used in woodland gardens because that's where they naturally grow. One of the great things about it is that it's low maintenance, meaning that you basically don't have to work at it too hard. The other big thing about them is they're in shade. And when you get into shade in the summertime, it's probably one of the best things that you can do. So you don't mind actually going out and looking at the garden. It also lends itself to a natural habitat for wildlife, for bees, for butterflies, for all the creatures that we have. But probably one of the best things I like about it is when you go into a woodland garden, you basically you get away from it all. You know, with all the craziness going on in our world today, going into a garden and being surrounded by one is pretty much a stress relief, and it brings you into a whole different world of being very, very calm. So first of all, when you're thinking about a woodland garden, think about the different types of themes that you would want to use when thinking about it before starting the woodland garden. One of them is a native one, meaning, make a garden out of all the native plants that we have, and Maryfield definitely has a lot of those. Another type of theme would be your Asian garden, the ones that originated over in Asia and Japan, especially. There's a meadow garden. A meadow garden is when you have a lot of perennials and a lot of low plants, and you don't really have any shrubs at all. And then you have the trees. There's also a dominant plant garden. And what I mean by that is if you've ever been in the woods before and you see a lot of big trees and then you only see ferns underneath it, it's a very simple type of garden, but you use one dominant plant in that. Another one is choosing plants that basically bring wildlife into your garden. There's a lot of plants out there, that have berries, that have flowers, that are nesting places for birds, that sort of thing. One of my favorite ones is the white garden, where you have basically just green leaves, and then all the flowers that bloom in that are white. There's a sample of a white garden over there in that photograph. But probably my favorite theme garden is my own enchanted garden, or my own enchanted woodland, where you actually don't have a theme, that you basically can do whatever you want in your garden and make it beautiful and make it real original. So one of the first things to think about is the concepts of design. I could go in for hours and hours and hours on, the concepts of design. There's classes out there for them. These are some of the ones that you can focus on. These concepts of design are mainly for any kind of artwork. When you talk about signs, when you talk about a car, designing a car, when you're talking about interior design, anything at all that you want to design, these type of things actually are what you use to make the design. These are international. These are what everyone uses. But for me, when it comes to a garden, I think there's a couple of those that are actually only specified just for a garden. And one of those is scent. And I've never seen a person actually go up to a painting and smell it. But when you design a garden, I mean, you have more than just the sight of something. You have the scent of it. You have the air surrounding it. You have the sunlight, how it reflects off of plants. And it's constantly moving, it's constantly changing. That's what makes it so much more unique than some of the other types of designs out there. When you look at a painting, you literally look at it and it's the same thing over the same time, over the same day, over the same week, over the same year, over the same century. When you're actually working with plants and you're working with the outdoors, they're basically, when you look at that garden, you will never ever see it like that ever again. It changes from moment to moment. That's one of the things I love about it. And one of those is scent. Being able to smell the different flowers on there. Right now, I'm actually smelling fall. With all the misty weather out there and everything, you can actually smell fall coming into season. The other thing is weather. You can look at a sunny day, you can look at a foggy day. I remember one time I was coming into the shrub area and it was sunny, but the sprinklers just went off. I went out there and looked. It looked like there were thousands and thousands of crystals on all their leaves reflecting the sunlight. And I told my boss, I said, "Can you believe all this?" And he's like looking at it going, "Believe what, Louis?" And I'm like, "Look at all the crystals on all the leaves." And he looked at it and he didn't see it. And he's like, "Oh my gosh, how could I not see that?" So weather is a big part of, design and how plants reflect and how things work with different types of weather. Especially the other one I love is fog. The other thing is when you're doing a design, you're doing it for not just one design, but you're doing 4 designs. You're doing it a design for winter, a design for spring, a design for summer, and also a design for fall. So basically, when you're doing a design, a woodland design or any design when it comes to gardens, You're actually in our area, you're doing 4 designs, and we'll get further into that. But the best thing about designing for a garden is time. And what I mean by that is when you first plant a garden, it looks very young, it looks very sparse because the plants haven't grown into it yet. But it literally, over time, it evolves, it changes, it gets older, it gets more mature. Trees start to take off. The flowers are more abundant, and it really takes a very interesting shape as it moves through time. And that's probably one of the best things I love about designing for gardens is that concept of design and getting to that point of a very old type of garden. So when you first set out to do a woodland design, what first thing that I always think about is a pathway. You're going into the garden, you're going to become a part of the garden. You're not going to actually look in at it. You're going to be a part of it. And the woods or whatever you are that's going to make a garden, you need to make a pathway through it. I like the idea of that pathway being more twists and turns, the sense of mystery of what's behind the next curve. But that's basically what you start out with. It's good to put some flags in to kind of design it that way of where that garden is, where that pathway is going to go. And then after that, then you decided to go into hardscape. I mean, do you want any patios within this garden? Do you want a water feature, benches, a fire pit, a fireplace, an outdoor kitchen, or whatever? But the hardscape is what you do after setting up the pathway. You decide on doing something like that. Afterwards, then you start to, think about the plants. Some of the basics for that is what I call the waterfall effect. And what I mean by that is right next to the path, you do ground covers. And then after the ground covers, you do the small, medium, and large perennials. And then further up, you do some of the smaller and larger type shrubs. And then beyond that, you do the understory trees. And then beyond that, you do the larger trees. So it makes like a waterfall effect. The top of the waterfall being the trees, the bottom of that waterfall being the ground cover. So when you look at that, the plant choices, you go with your overstory trees. That's what you start out first. Most people probably already have those already there because it is a woods. You think about them in the evergreen sense and also the deciduous sense. The next part of that design will be putting in the understory trees, the evergreens first and then the deciduous, then going down to your shrubs, deciding on what I call the foundation plants, which are normally your evergreens and your deciduous shrubs. And then afterwards, designing into a more intimate type of garden when it comes to the perennials. And then you go into the ground covers. I always think of maybe leaving spaces for annuals that you have to plant every year. They basically give you a lot of flower throughout the season. Not like perennials that come up and do their song and dance, and then afterwards another one would take over. Another one that people overlook a lot is vines. You can literally take vines and start those going up the trees, going onto the shrubs. And a lot of people don't realize this, but you can take vines and put them on the ground. I've seen clematis actually as a ground cover, which can be very, very attractive. And then another thing that's overlooked when you're designing is bulbs. We just got our bulbs in, and I always get excited about those. Bulbs are ultimate and awesome for putting into a garden. Most of them are extremely reliable. I just got done putting all my bulbs in the refrigerator because I'm going to throw some in January. I'm going to be doing a bulb seminar sometime next week, so I can go into detail about that. Okay, so once you get all the core stuff involved, then we come into the details of design. This is probably one of my favorite parts of my seminar. I just scattered and did, some brain thinking of different aspects of the designs and different concepts to use that are somewhat more unique for a woodland design. One of them is the concept of amoebas. And what I mean by amoebas is clusters of the same plants or intermixing two plants together and having them in different sections, almost, like a pattern or like a quilt, if you would. When you go out into the woods, you literally see plants that are clustered together. And that's what I mean by amoebas. Putting those in, you could have a cluster of plants that are very unique that you only use one, but you can also use amoebas as is to bond the area together, and having three or probably three or five of them clustered in different areas along it, it kind of connects the pathway as you go on, and your eyes will connect those as they go down the path. Amoebas are awesome. It gets to a point too when they start to collide with each other, and that's when they become a lot more mature. You can do amoebas with bulbs. You can do them with perennials. You can actually do them, with shrubs. But amoebas are really important because they do tend to make the garden a little bit more natural looking. Second thing is focal points. A focal point is something that stands out within the landscape that's a little different, something that draws your eye towards it. When you're designing in a woodland garden, having those twists and turns, when you come around a bend and you look and you see the garden and you see the path going straight forward, putting in different types of focal points along the way is a great way to draw your attention down the woodland path. Another focal point is what I call a vista, where you literally will have it way off in the distance, off the path, and you see it. And then you build almost like a cavern on either side of it, of larger plants going down to be in the waterfall effect, and then having ground cover to focus it all the way down. And we'll get to that, in a moment later on in my seminar. A secondary type of focal point is when something blooms or something stands out, but it only stands out for a week or two. It's usually either flowers are blooming or maybe a fall color of one of the plants is very orange or something like that. So it stands out, but it stands out just for a brief moment in time compared to a focal point, which is usually there through all 4 seasons. There's a lot of different types of ways you can do these focal points and get them in, so it makes the garden a lot more exciting. As I mentioned before, when you're designing, you're doing 4 seasons. And what I mean by that is you're designing for spring, you're designing for fall, you're designing for winter, and then also for summer. So when you're looking at your design and you're looking at some of the aspects, take a look at the plants, take a look about how they relate to each other, and take a look about how they're going to look in different seasons. A lot of people look for flowers. A lot of people look for, other aspects of it and how that plant is interesting within a certain season. Another thing to think about too, when you're designing this garden, is flower times. And what I mean by that is you have, let's say your snowdrops. Your snowdrops, start in the spring, and then your hellebores take over from there, and then you have a cherry tree blooming after that, and then you have this and you have that. So you have different pockets of flowers throughout the season. As I mentioned before, it's always a good idea to take annuals and maybe stick a few of those in because they give you consistent flower color through most of the spring into the summer and then into fall. So if there is any lag time with flowers, then maybe you would, basically the annuals will take over the show for you. When thinking about it, the design, think about pairing off evergreens with deciduous. And what I mean by that is when you start to literally put in the garden, you don't want all deciduous plants because then during the wintertime, all you have are sticks and, brown flowers on the sticks and shriveled up leaves and that sort of scenario. So getting some evergreens in there actually can play off of all your colorful deciduous plants. And there's evergreens can flower as well. But it's always nice to have a nice balance of evergreens with your deciduous plants and pairing them up. When looking at your plants, think about the plants and what other interests do they have other than flowers. You can go into the different types of bark. You can go into basically the root flares. I mean, on that slide that I did at the very beginning, that was a beech tree, and it comes down and it has that beautiful, root flare that comes out. Think about berries. Think about cones. Think about leaves. Leaves can be extremely interesting, but think about the plant more so than just the flowers. One thing about a woodland garden is it's normally a very informal garden. And so it likes to be real curvy and very no straight lines in it. You can make a garden, a very formal type garden for a woodland garden. And, as I said, it can be very interesting to use that, a very symmetrical type of deal. But a lot of people, when they are doing woodland gardens, they do tend to want to be more of a natural type of form. So we try to kind of stay away from the straight line type of deal and try to put a lot of curves within the amoebas, within the shrubs. You never really want to do a lot of straight lines. Another thing is going into the idea of narrow versus wide. And what I mean by that is when you're going down your pathway, having like no perennials and no ground covers, but having shrubs. So you have almost like these walls and you're going through it. And then all of a sudden it opens up. And when it opens up, it all of a sudden becomes, a big room, and we'll get to the room aspect of it. But literally having that sort of scenario, then narrowing it down again, and then opening it back up again. There's a really good ways to enlarge a very small area where you actually have evergreens in there, so you can't see the full aspect of your garden all at once. When you go into the entranceway into a garden, it's always good to not be able to see it all at once and make it almost into a mystery. And as you go around the curves of the garden, it's very you don't know what to expect around the next curve. I think it's really fun to do that, and it's a really great way to make a large distance within a small area. The room aspect of the garden, and I've done these before, where you have like one room, which is like a just one plant meadow type deal, where you have just a ton of ferns, and you walk through the ferns, make sure the ferns are real close to the path, so they actually hit your legs, so you can feel it, you can feel the plants, and then have it close up, and then have it go into a garden with a bench, having all sorts of different bulbs in there, having shrubs in there, and then narrowing it down again, and then going into another room. It's really interesting to play off those type of scenarios where you go into like your hosta room with ferns and maybe some azaleas or something, and then going in and having another room that's totally different. It's neat to be able to play around with all that stuff. So another thing I wanted to mention, and I skipped it over, is moss. Moss is an awesome plant to use in a woodland garden. It just makes everything look aged. It literally is easy to do. You can have moss growing on pots. You can have moss growing on rocks. You can have a moss pathway going through it. But moss makes it more enchanting. It makes it more real. It makes it look more like a woods. Having it on like old, like roots and stuff like that, it's always a good idea. There's a client of mine that lives over in Reston, and they have a moss lawn, which I've always loved. And one time this guy comes up, he was from the lawn service, and he came up and he knocked on the door and he said, we could get rid of all your moss and put in a beautiful lawn for you. And the guy looked at it and was like, no, I think I want my moss. I love my moss. So needs to say that the moss is still there. Some more concepts that I want to talk to you about is leggy plants. remember, when you're in the woods and you're in shade, most plants are not as dense as they would be if they were in full sun. A great example of that is a mountain laurel. I've seen mountain laurel in full sun. Usually they're mature plants and a tree falls down. It's hard to get mountain laurel to actually start to grow in full sun. But if it happens when it's mature, happens to get in full sun, it should be fine. But what happens in the woods and when it's pretty much a shady area, it gets these nice twisted bonsai like looking branches on it. That's a more natural form. It's a more woodsy type form. It's a great opportunity to get some of those perennials growing underneath it. It can actually is a great opportunity to see the wood of the plant. Again, more natural looking. Rhododendrons are the same way. Pieris japonica is sort of like that. I've seen hollies do that. So leggy plants are not necessarily bad. It's sort of like almost like a mindset. And it makes it a little bit more interesting when you see the structure of the plants, more so than just the flowers and the leaves. When you're designing this garden, you got to remember there's usually big trees in there, and big trees drink a lot of water. A lot of native plants and a lot of other plants that grow in shade, they can take some dry because they literally grow in shade with trees. There is a few plants that grow in shade that are the swampy plants. If you do swampy plants in a dry area, you're going to have to supplement the watering every now and then. I don't mean like you have to water them constantly. But what I do mean is that when we do go into a drought mode where it hasn't rained for a long time, it's always a good idea to make sure to water your plants. And when you do water them, make sure you water them very, very deep, almost like a slow rain like we're having today, that lasts a couple of days. So you want it, to water not just for a couple of minutes, but you want to, put it out there for an hour or two with a sprinkler system or something like that, just to give it a nice little boost. When talking about big trees, I always talk about I love trees and I love saving trees. When you plant around a big tree, there's what I call the sacred ground. And what I mean by that is you go from the trunk out, probably about 3, maybe 4 feet. That is what I call the sacred ground. You don't want to really disturb that very much. And the reason why is that root system literally is all in that area and they extend out for a long, long period of time. And if you do a small area real close to it and you destroy that, think of a slice of pizza. All that root system going out from there gets wider and wider as it goes out. If you do need to plant next to a big tree, plant something very small and plant something that is what I call a runner, meaning that it can spread over time and can interchange with the root system of the tree. If you go around the tree and you destroy the root system, it takes a long time for a plant to go from destroying its root system to actually dying, and you might not make that connection. So anytime you're going next to a tree, just make sure that you respect the tree and try to do smaller things that are runners around it. And again, I love root flares on trees. I think they add a lot of character to a garden, and so I wouldn't want to hide those anyway. So water features. It's always nice to have a water feature in a garden. Remember, most of those will have to have electricity to make them go. Make sure that, be really careful with mosquitoes. If you want to bring in nature, one of the best things to do with that is to have a water source of some kind. You can get some interesting plants growing in there if need be as well. Into a water type scenario. But think about water, they are high maintenance. It is always a great idea to put in a water feature that basically you can hear the noise of the water. It's very serene, it's very calming. I love, going down and sitting next to a stream in the woods. The same sort of thing happens there. And as I said, it always brings in, wildlife if that's one of your things that you want to do. Some of the other things is to add to this garden, a more natural type garden, is putting in old logs. I have seen people take old logs and then rip them open to a certain degree and put in ferns in them and put in things that can live in that type of decaying type of wood. Boulders, putting boulders in or stone and having the moss growing on them. And then the other one is the roots themselves. I mean, when you get old trees that have fallen over, getting some of those roots flares and flipping them over can make a very, very interesting looking type of focal point, especially if some vines or something growing up it or whatever. But there's a lot of creativity out there when doing this, and you can't do anything wrong with it. And what I mean by that is a lot of people think that you have to do A, B, C, D, and E when doing a design. With Woodland Gardens, you can go in there and pretend like the birds planted it all for you. And there's a natural beauty to this that is less about the design and more about the natural quality of just things coming together. One thing I really liked was tunnels. And what I mean by that, when we talked about the path going through the woods and having the walls, well, actually, you can take those walls that go up, trim them back, and then let the shrubs themselves over top. So you can actually having a tunnel going through there. It would be neat to do something like that when you have a room like type of garden where you can go through a tunnel, you go into a room and then wind through that room and then go into another room. Some of the other stuff that you can use in there, and I always like the idea, is using garden art. A lot of people use little statues and that sort of scenario in there. It makes it a little bit more personable. I have been to gardens where there's a lot of artwork and a lot of themes. There's, like the cement, mushrooms coming up that are all over with moss. I'm having little ceramic creatures, looking at those through the garden. Another thing, I'm skipping down to the very end, is having very small type of things in there, tiny little details that most people would actually miss. But when you have that detailed oriented type of eye, you can pick up, like having, a little salamander, on one of the branches or something like that. One of the ceramic ones or something like that can be very, very interesting. Having hanging baskets hanging from tree limbs is always really pretty. Potted plants, again, having 3 potted plants going down, you can connect the pathway that way. You can add color and personality into this garden with potted plants. So I mean, there's just so much to be able to use from all sorts of different things to do these woodland gardens. When you again, one thing that I did mention before is a vista. A vista is, and it's almost like a canyon that's going through a garden. It's not something you walk on, but it's something you look at. And you have that waterfall effect going down off of the path, so you can see through a long distance. You might even be able to see a path going down further down in the vista, and then having the focal point. And again, it makes it seem more like there's a lot more distance in there, and it makes it seem more open. Again, closing up and then opening up to more, and then closing it up again. It's always neat to be able to do that. And again, if you have a small type of garden, it's you being able to make those tunnels and these things real close, and then opening them up makes it seem like there's a lot more room in there. Okay, so now let's talk about the actual plants themselves. When you've done your design, now you're coming out and you're thinking about the plants themselves. One thing to think about is, what does the plant have to offer? And there's plants out there that can offer so much. And when do they offer it? The first thing on this is the flowers, berries, cones, and leaves. So when you're looking at a plant by itself, look at it through all 4 seasons. And what does it look like through the year? And then what is it going to look like in 3 years? And what is it going to look like in 10 years? Am I going to have to trim this back? Am I going to have to do this to it? So really kind of connect to the plants themselves and how much they need, meaning, there's plants that just amaze me. I saw Wigelia in full shade, a variegated one, and basically it was flowering. It was leggy. It was very lengthy. It was almost ran along the ground. But Wigelia is a full sun type plant, but literally it can take full shade and give you a little bit of oomph, which I was just shocked about when I saw that. How much water is the plant going to need? How much space the plant's going to need. Usually when you plant a garden, keep in mind that it's going to basically be somewhat sparse until the plants actually grow into it. If it doesn't look sparse, you probably over planted a little bit. You need the plants to mature, to get bigger. Here on Maryfield, we do have some very mature plants here, but for most, we have to learn patience to let the plants go. Another thing about it is, especially if you want to bring nature into into your garden, what kind of benefits does it have to nature? One of them is food. You think about berries for food, but you also think about leaves. There's a lot of native plants out there that literally are needed for butterflies and caterpillars. Caterpillars are one of the bottom of the food chain, and they're really important. I know that a lot of people don't like to see eaten leaves, but in essence, they feed a lot of animals, and they will never, ever probably kill a tree. But, putting up with a few eaten branches, eaten leaves, then probably it's not a really big deal. So when you think about it, think about butterflies, think about the bees, think about what that plant can do for nature. Another thing is texture. I'm going to show you a plant or a photograph later on that's perfect for texture. Texture is not about color. It's about basically the texture of things, texture of leaves, needles, texture of the bark, of branching, of stems. Think about texture. Don't think about color as much. Color definitely plays a part in it. You can get color from leaves, which can actually last a lot longer than color from flowers. But essence, again, focus on plants and what they have to offer you. One characteristic about plants, there are plants out there that are runners. And what I mean by that is that you have a plant and then all of a sudden it takes off. And what I mean, it kind of roots out and it kind of spreads out into the garden. And there's also clumping type plants. And clumpers just mean that they basically get to be a bigger clump every year. And you can always take those out, cut them up into smaller pieces, move them around the garden, and then they start to clump up again. A good example of that is hosta. One other thing that people think about is plants that reseed. That's one of the characteristics that I think is somewhat important. And the reason why is there's some plants out there that reseed and reseed and reseed and reseed, and all of a sudden you decided that you don't want that plant anymore because it just goes everywhere. And then you have plants that you find out that reseed and you're like really, really happy. A couple of them is the foxglove. Foxglove can reseed itself and it is wonderful. It will last from year to year to year. Another reseeder that's really good is the hellebores. Hellebores literally, seed themselves. The first year you get like these 2 little leaves, and the second year you get like 8 little leaves. It takes about 4 or 5 years for actually a hellebore to go from a seed to a flower. The neat thing about hellebores too is that they bloom in the early spring, and the bees just love them. They get so hungry in the springtime or in the late winter that the hellebores really help with that, even though they're not natives, but the bees do love them. You can get very different looking flowers on them. But if you get a few varieties in there and they start to cross-pollinate, you get some very, very interesting looking flowers on there. Another one is interest versus background. And what I mean by that, not every plant needs to be in the spotlight. You do need backup plants in your garden that just stay there. They're the foundation plants, and then you go in and you decided what plants are interesting, and then you put those in there. But it's good to understand about interesting plants versus non-interesting plants. They play off each other very, very well. You can't have all, superstars, and you can't have all, plants that don't have any personality. Um, but as I said before, when picking out plants, basically look at the plant and decide on how you can use it in your garden and look at what it can offer you through all 4 seasons. Once you start to learn about the plant and you get personal with it, and you understand the plant, you understand its needs, what it needs, it will guarantee to flourish for you. Understanding them and what they need is extremely important in a garden. And that's one of the reasons why I love gardening. Very briefly about native plants. Remember, native plants, most of them actually are in the woods. There's a few that are not. They're what I call the frontiers. If you take down a woods and they started from dirt, you have native plants that are designed to get that soil ready for the hardwood forest. And a lot of those plants like full sun. But when you get to the forest, that's when you get into the plants that we're talking about. And those are the ones that love to be in the shade. They grow naturally here. They've been here for 70 million years, and they play off each other. They know each other. They've grown up together. It's amazing how when you go into a native type forest, how you can really feel the connection with everything that's going on there. It's a very well balanced type of deal. Another thing about it is that it really does help the environment. The more trees that we plant, the more natives we plant, the more we get back to the original aspect of it. I always call it a muted type of beauty. And what I call the native eye. When you're looking at a native garden and you can see all the little bits and pieces of it, it really is spectacular. And understand how, as I said, everything plays off of everything else. It brings a neat harmony into who you are and in the way that you interact with nature, like going into a garden like that. It brings nature into it. It brings the butterflies and all the animals because they're all familiar with it. Again, they've had relationships with each other for millions and millions of years, and it restores the wood back into the harmony of what it originally was like. They say that if you take a cubic yard of native soil that's never been disturbed, that has so many threads of fungus in it that it equals the amount of the wire in the whole network of the whole world. Basically, it just baffles me on everything that goes on in the native forest. So let's talk about maintenance. People that like low maintenance type of gardening, this is definitely for you. When you plant something in the shade, you have a lot of wiggle room, meaning that, if you forget to water it once and it's in the shade, it probably will forgive you. If you forget to water something in full sun in the summertime, it probably won't. Being in shade, the water lasts a little bit longer, and you have a lot more wiggle room as to when to water it to get it established. Weeding, remember you're weeding in shade, by the way, you're not weeding in sun. Get rid of all the invasive plants. Anything that pops up in your yard that you don't want, get rid of it right away, especially before it reseeds. Another thing is leave the leaves alone. And what I mean by that is those leaves basically are build up the soil. You're going to have a compost pile, but the compost pile is going to be like right on the top of your soil, or right on the top. And those leaves and those branches and all that stuff, they basically will literally go in and make your soil incredible. All the trillions of bacteria and funguses in there will eat it up, and your plants will love that. When you do trimming, trim everything down into small pieces and just leave it on the ground, so that can be digested by the earth. Any invasive plants or any type that you don't want around, it's always a good idea to remove those just in case there's seeds or something on them. With a woodland garden, basically try to leave it alone in the wintertime. You don't need to trim things back. A lot of beautiful winter gardens have the dead flowers on them. They do have some real neat branching on them. If you do need to trim, trim in the early spring, especially with evergreens. Always trim those in the early spring. Now, in general, anything that flowers, it's always a good idea to trim them right after they flower. But the thing is about maintenance is that you won't mind going out there during the summertime because it's in shade, wonderful shade. My office is in full sun. And afterwards, I go into those woods in the evening after work, and it's like 10 degrees less because it's in shade. So you can actually enjoy it. So let's look at some of these gardens. Um, I realize now this is the garden from a friend of mine. And I didn't ask her for permission to use it, but I don't think she'll mind. This is a garden. This is a woodland garden. It's one of my favorites. All the pathway in there is made out of layers of tree stumps. It was beautiful the way it was laid out there. There's a bench in there. Look at those. Emerald green arborvitaes. You notice that they're not literally touching each other, but they still give you a barrier. It's like an imaginary barrier. When you focus on those, the stuff behind them will literally become a blur. So it does give you the concept of giving you some privacy. This person does not have any deer, by the way. So some beautiful hostas in there. You see how it winds through? And when you're walking down there beyond that bench, you don't know what's down there. So it does give you like a sense of mystery as to what's behind the next curve. This is the amoeba effect to a certain degree, kind of a mishmash over a long period of time, with different flowers, with different textures. There's a mossy log in there. There is a silver flame Pieris japonica. There's a lot of color in here. It's more of a meadow. There is a few shrubs in there, but everything is pretty low. It's a beautiful garden. I like this one. You're going into it. It does say that you're going into a woodland garden. It does have that. This is an early spring, I would imagine, because the flowers on that are just coming out. But again, it's very narrow. You're going through it. You don't know what's back there. I like the idea of some of the color in there. It's just beautiful. And the sun coming through, since it's probably early spring. So the bottom right hand is snowdrops and moss. And it's beautiful the way that you have that amoeba effect in there, basically, looking through, and you can see, a distance and all the big trees. And that is basically in the wintertime, by the way. The one to the left is you have the boulders going on there. You have some flowers in the spring from the rhodas and the azaleas with the hostas. So again, no deer. I think there's a little bit of water going through there as well. Very, very earthy looking. And then the top right is somewhat of a meadow. It looks to me like there might be woodland hyacinth going on there. And then in the distance, you have some azaleas. There's a beautiful effect that has. And the vista on that, going out, is really, really pretty. I would love to come out onto a path, look at something like that, and then turn and go into something that's pretty narrow, and then go into another perspective. So as I said, I love bulbs. A lot of bulbs come out before the leaves come out on the trees. So you can take, hyacinth, you can take tulips, you can take the daffodils and put those in your garden. And basically, you would be able to have those before the leaves come out on the trees. I think that is a winter hazel in the back there, or a serviceberry that's coming back out. And azaleas, and there's some fern flowers at the bottom with the bench. I always tell people to make sure that you have places to sit. And remember, this is all in the shade, so it's going to be very comforting in the summertime. One of my favorite things, or my favorite plants, is the rhododendrons. They're actually invasive over in Ireland. But they're beautiful in a woodland garden, and they can get big, and they do have that legginess about them, but you can stick under different perennials underneath them. So this is my style. I love green gardens. This is, remember when I told you about texture? This is exactly what I mean about texture. You have that boxwood, you have that ginger ground cover at the bottom. You have those pebbles for the stone, for the pathway. Just a beautiful green, very, very lush green type of garden, which is probably one of my favorites. This is in the springtime, and this is more of a meadow. If you look out, there's really not any shrubs in there. Everything's pretty low, and you can see a distance. It's just a beautiful place to sit down. So when I taught you about the mono type garden, where you have one dominant plant, one of the ones I love is the hydrangea. The neat thing about hydrangeas is a lot of the shade-loving ones, the Macphilias, love shade, deep shade, but they also are very dependent on their pH of the soil as to what color they are. So you can have a whole different palette of color from the hydrangeas, anywhere from a very, very deep blue into lighter blues, into purplish blues, all the way into real bright pinks. They do bloom for a long period of time. There's a lot of hydrangeas these days that bloom off of new and old growth. So basically, you can cut these things, the new and old growth, you can cut them to the ground, and they will come up and they will bloom for the no matter what. They don't need to be on old growth. The top right-hand one I put in here, that is an outdoor kitchen and a fireplace and a water feature and a patio. And it's out in the middle of nowhere. Talking about someone, going out into their yard and literally getting away from it all. It's just a beautiful setting. I just love that picture. And then the bottom one is just a woodland garden. It's just, walking through and seeing the trees and then seeing all the different plants on the bottom. The top right is a photograph. It's probably from where I go hiking. That is basically the New York fern, which is a runner. It's not a clumper. And it turns into a bright yellow in the fall. But that's a mono. That's a one dominant plant type of garden. The reason why I put the one in on the left with the dogwoods is that the azaleas bloom on it. That is classic our area type of spring, when you have all the different types of azaleas blooming, and then you complement that with the dogwoods. And then you notice in front of that, you have all the perennials that are just starting out. The bottom right is your primrose. Primrose loves the winter, or loves this shady type area. It has somewhat of an Asian type flair with it, with the bamboo little fence going through there. I thought that was interesting. Gave it a little bit of personality. So I went over to Peggy's garden back in the springtime, and she had a huge amount of foxglove, and I fell in love with it. She had all sorts of whites, pinks, purples. They cross-pollinate each other, so they come out with all these different colors. They're what's called a biperennial or biannual, which means that the first year they seed and they grow, and the second year they flower. She had tons and tons of seeds this year. That is a signature plant for a woodland enchanted forest. It's a beautiful plant to use. And people don't realize this, but these stalks of flowers can get 4, 5 feet high. They can get really tall. It's amazing when you look at them, especially when they're in big clusters. The one up above on the right-hand side is a habitat type garden. There is a program out there where you can get certified. There's a checklist of all the things that you need. This we need more than anything else because supporting nature is really pretty much supporting ourselves. You notice that there is a source of water back there. And then we have like the azaleas going through white clouds at the bottom. Again, one of those monotype of gardens. And I love azaleas in the springtime, in the woods. It's just so beautiful. The Japanese forest grass is one of my favorites. It looks like water. It looks like a wave. I love the way that they brought this path into almost nothing, so that you have to wade yourself through it and you hit the plants. I love touching plants. That Berinia over there is wonderful as like a little semi, focal point, if you will. The coleus in there, the statue, just a beautiful, intimate garden. I also love the Japanese maple up there. When thinking about the amoeba effect, one option that you have with native plants, one of them is the woodland poppy with the Virginia bluebells. They bloom exactly at the same time. The actual woodland poppies are native, but they are endangered. So literally putting some of those in your garden is really important. Another thing about them is they reseed very easily, and everyone likes the Virginia bluebells. So, but they complement each other very nicely. Another one that's a good pairing is the tiarella or foam flower with the woodland phlox. They actually bloom at the same time as well. You have that white type of like a jar type flower on it. And then you have the big flowers from the phlox. And then above that is I'm going to say bottle brush. They look like little tiny bottle brushes on the foam flower. And one of my favorite plants, and I know a lot of people don't like it, but I love it, is the violets. I think they're really beautiful in the springtime. We have a neighbor of mine that actually lets them grow all through their yard. And during the springtime, he has thousands and thousands and thousands of violets all through his grass. This is a bottlebrush buckeye. This is a native plant, and as you can tell, the butterflies like it. And there's one little monarch in there as well, which with all the swallowtails, which I thought was really interesting. We do sell these, and they're just a great understory, large type of shrub type of plant. And they are really important. The bees love it, and also the butterflies. So keep that in mind when you're designing your garden. The pairing of the dogwoods and the redbuds, again, they come out at the same time. With the redbuds, we've got numerous different varieties of those out there. If you do like a lot of leaf color, they come with all sorts of leaf color after they bloom. And we just got one in that is a dwarf variety called amethyst, which gives you a few red leaves on it. But red buds are wonderful, especially with the dogwoods. Up above is the Japanese forest grass again, with a few hostas. And then at the bottom, we have the pathway going through moss. I couldn't resist and put that in there. I love the way that they did the stone walls on that. I mean, you can actually sit on those. So these are some beautiful woodland gardens. This is a patio out in the middle of nowhere. I love the fern up there on the pedestal. And I like the idea of having the fire out there. There's an evergreen out there, which is nice for the winter time, but just a nice, relaxing area to to enjoy yourself. And this is a typical garden. I put this in here. Again, when you're looking at that path and it makes the turn, you really do wonder what's going back there. They did put in a a bird thing on the tree. Some hostas. There's a pot over there. They don't have any deer because there's hostas there. What I foresee is having maybe some clematis going up on some of those trees. But again, there's just so many options that you have for creating these gardens. And then the last one is what I always do is having the lawn chair. I think it's really important to go out and sit down in your garden and just enjoy the garden instead of going out there and working in your garden. So I always suggest to get a lawn chair and so you can move it around to different parts of your garden so that when you're able to get the chance, just go out there and relax. So that's my seminar. Thank you very much. Are we going to have a questioning aspect to this? We
Yes, Louis, we are. We are. Um,
we are.
we are. Just for people that have been writing in, I had some trouble with the chat function, so I'm not able to see anything on chat, but I can see the Q&A tab. So if you did try to write anything on chat, please put it over on the Q&A tab. But we're just going to start from the beginning here. And the first one is, um, you have any scented plants for a woodland garden that you would recommend?
Do I have scented plants for?
Scented,
Okay,
yes.
definitely. One of them for a semi-shaded garden would be the gardenia. Another one would be the osmanthus. We also have um, the autumnalis type of clematis. There is the native one, which is also scented. Be very careful with that one because it does tend to take over a little bit. Another one is lilies. Lilies do very well in a scented garden. Um, the hyacinth in the early spring. You can plant hyacinth in your garden and they smell amazing. So yeah, there's a few of those options.
Wonderful. All right. The next question is somebody wants to replace their English ivy with a native that can compete with Japanese maple roots. Do you have any recommendations for that?
So Japanese maples want to compete with it. So what I would suggest, if you have a Japanese maple, that's probably going to be a focal point. Underneath a Japanese maple, you could put in some of the tiarella with the woodland phlox. Those are both natives. Another option would be, I mean, the Cresta iris. Cresta irises are a runner. You can put a few of those in. They actually, they're little tiny irises that bloom in the spring. They actually might bloom before the leaves come out, which would be awesome. I know that the tiarella with the woodland phlox, they would probably bloom before the Japanese maple comes out. Um, Another option would be violets. Violets underneath there. And again, you have to watch that root system. Violets do run, so you will be able to put those in. And so would the tiarella, and so would the woodland phlox, and so would the irises. So all those are runners, and they will actually be able to take over the area at the bottom of them.
Wonderful. All right. Our next question is for your woodland garden. Any evergreen trees that would grow well in shade that you could recommend? A lot of recommendations today.
Does it have to be a native?
Did not specify whether it was a native.
Okay. So one option would be the hemlock. Hemlocks do really good in shade. And as a side note on that, we do have a a what do you call that? One of those forests that never been cut down. I forget the name of it. Anyway, there is one of those over in the Clifton area, where you have an old growth forest of hemlocks, and hemlocks are great to use in that. Another option would be a holly. The American holly does very well. You see it all over the place here. One of the newer plants that we got in is called a Japanese plum yew in a tree form. It almost reminds me of a Norfolk pine. I would imagine in a couple of years that that plant is going to become very, very popular. The neat thing about it is it's very deer resistant. It can take full sun to full shade, and it literally grows slower, but it's a beautiful, beautiful texture plant. So those are some options for shade evergreens.
Wonderful. That's great. Next is another
Oh,
another person.
so there's one plant that
Oh,
is not, but people don't know about it, and it's called a big leaf magnolia. We do have a few left. A big leaf magnolia has the biggest leaf of any native plant in North America. The leaves get about 3 feet in length and about a foot wide. They also flower and they have that incredible scent to them. I have seen a few of them in the woods around here, and there's some over at Meadowlark Park as well. And I have seen them down at Old Rag. But that plant in a woodland garden, they get about 30 feet high. But it just would add such an incredible presence to itself, almost like a tropical type of deal. So it's not an evergreen, but literally it loves to be in shade. It loves that protection from high winds. And remember, that's another plant when someone said about scent, the sweet bay magnolia and the big leaf magnolia send out a lot of scent when it comes to their flowers.
gotcha, gotcha. Wonderful. Next question is for a sloped woodland garden, so woodland garden on a slope. What shrubs and ground covers would you recommend?
Okay, so with any kind of slope, one thing you can do, especially if it's a very large slope, is to put retaining walls in, dry stack walls coming down, so you have that effect. If you can't do that, first of all, putting in any kind of shrubs would basically get those root system in there just to help with that. And you can go with anything from the Japanese plum yews. You could possibly go with, gosh, there's some. You could go with boxwood. You could go with hollies. You could go with euonymus. Some of the euonymuses do very well in a shaded area. There's one that's called emerald gaiety. That one would do very well. And there's one that's called moon shadow. That will take over the area. There's a plant, a shrub that's called Socacoca or sweet box. That one would do the area very well because it, saves soil. It will catch leaves, and the leaves will settle into the ground. Another one is, your typical portulaca. Pachysandra. You could put in some vinca. You could put in, the ryope. There's endless amounts of different plants to use on there. Another thing you could do is put in a couple of the understory trees. Putting in trees, again, you want that root system to invade into that slope so that it saves the soil. So you probably want a big tree or a smaller tree. You want some, shrubs in there, and then below the shrubs, put in the running type of ground covers.
Wonderful. Well, speaking of ground covers, this person is asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on growing moss. They had a woodland shady garden and transplanted moss from the forest, but unfortunately, after about a year, it did not do well.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
So with moss in general, you got to remember that it does not have any root system. that it literally gets all its stuff from the air. Um, One thing to do is make sure that you water it. Watering it is very important. Make sure it's in shade. Make sure that it literally has humidity around it. Out in the woods, when it gets very dry, all the moss basically turns really, really crispy and doesn't have any kind of green to it. And then once it starts to rain, it comes back to life again. So it likes to be, I wanted, I think it likes to be an acidic soil. So if your soil is very alkaline, it's not going to work. So that's another very important thing about it. And the other thing about it is moisture. So I can't give you enough about moisture. I have heard that using a spigot on it with water that has chlorine in it can be devastating. But I talked to the people over in Reston who have that moss lawn, and they say they water it all the time with the sprinkler with spigot water that has chlorine on it, and it said it's not affected by that.
Next question is about mushrooms. Why do mushrooms grow on tree stumps or at the base of trees?
Because of the so you have mushrooms. So let's start at the beginning. So there's tons and tons of different types of funguses in the ground, and they move around, and they send up these mushrooms, and they literally will fill the air with spores and stuff so that they can reproduce. When you have rotting type of stuff, such as trees and things like that, they literally love that type of soil, and I guess they would eat that up. And I think that's why. They like decaying stuff. They like to break that stuff down. They eat that stuff. So that's probably why they do so well there.
Gotcha. Our next question is a woodland garden possible where there are a lot of deer present?
A lot of deer.
Deer. Mhm.
Yes. All right. So the first thing with deer is to get plants that are deer resistant. We do have numerous plants out there that they don't go for, but I have to emphasize that they're resistant. They're not proof. When a deer is hungry and he's dragging himself along the ground, dying of starvation, he will literally eat anything. So nothing is deer proof, but there are plants that they do not go after. We have a whole list of plants here. We have a bunch of annuals, perennials, trees, and shrubs that they don't go after. So yes, definitely. There's a lot of beautiful plants out there that are deer resistant. The other thing to remember too is we're getting into the rutting season. And that's when these males are out there and they're marking their territories. So if you have young trees out there, they basically can demolish them, they can destroy them. So it's just really a good idea to make sure that you protect those. Another thing to do is to use sprays. Get yourself a dog. It's really helpful. And there's all sorts of different ways to deter deer from coming onto your property. So, but yes, there's a lot of plants and a lot of areas where you can plant where the deer are not going to be that devastating.
Gotcha. Perfect. So next is, I don't know if you can think back, but this one person wants some clarification on the name of the runner that you mentioned before you were talking about Helleborus. Again, with a B possibly?
Okay, so hellebores are not runners.
Oh, no, not the hellebore. You were talking about a runner before the hellebore. Do you remember
Okay.
what that was called?
Okay, so I think the runners I went over, one of them is Tiarella. There's
Mhm.
one that's called Running Tapestry. It's a foam flower. That's a runner. Another one is the woodland poppies. They tend to run. Another one is the Cresta iris. They tend to run. Um, there is a running type of mondo grass, but be very careful about that one because it will take over the world. What other runners did I talk about? I think those are the ones.
Well, hopefully that answered that person's question. If it didn't, we will have this
Yeah, I mean, I
piece
work here in
recording.
Merrifield, as you know, Danny. I'm always here other than Fridays. So, and if you do have a question about a specific plant, just call me up and we can talk about it. Um, they're basically, I'm always here to answer, those real specific questions about plants. And then, the customer can actually talk to me about, okay, I'm interested in this kind of runner, this ground cover. Can you name off some, or they can come in and we can go look at them, explain different ones to them, that sort of scenario.
Gotcha. Perfect. Um, well, we have just a few more questions and we can get through those. The next one is suggestions for native plants in dry shade.
Native plants in dry shade.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'm going through my mind here.
no worries.
Okay, so when you have dry shade, you can have anywhere from all those different types of viburnums. You can have the winter third viburnum. You can have, the brandywine viburnum. You can have all the different types of arrowwoods. Um, they do well in dry shade. As I said, I see them in the woods all the time. The black hall is another one that can take dry shade. Once they get established, you will definitely have to work on that plant to get it to the point where it can take the dry shade. Another option would be the nine bark. Nine bark likes moisture, but it can adapt to dry shade. Another one is the Fothergilla. Another one is the sweet spire. They can all take dry shade. Another option would be the different types of azaleas, all the deciduous azaleas, they can take, except for the swamp azalea, they can adapt to dry shade. Um, Another option would be the witch hazel, the native witch hazel. That one can take dry shade. But again, a lot of people think that a lot of these plants that I just mentioned are moist loving plants, and they are, but they can adapt to drier conditions. Again, when I'm out there in the woods and I see these plants in the wild and it hasn't rained for 2 months, I know they can take pretty dry shade. That's why I think that there's can absolutely do that.
Mhm. Perfect. You might have answered this question. Oh, go ahead.
I'm thinking the other ones, if you wanted some evergreens, one of them would be the Maryland holly, which is a type of American holly, which is it's a female holly. That's a dwarf variety. It gets about 2.5 feet high, about 4 feet wide. Again, I see hollies in the woods all the time. Another one would be your uh, your bayberry, the southern bayberry in particular. I have seen that in dry conditions, and that can take some shade. That's one of those that's going to be a little on the leggy side. And same with the inkberry holly, which loves water, but I've seen it in dry conditions. That's another one of those plants that can get very leggy. But again, those plants will be leggy, but they can take those conditions, that dry conditions.
Perfect. Next question is, and you might have already talked about it a little bit when we were answering the question about moss, but do you have any advice for transplanting moss? You talked about maintaining it, but how about transplanting it from one place to another?
Okay, so So I tried the sour milk thing, and it would turn into a complete disaster. People use the sour milk moss thing where they grind it up and they put it into a blender and then they spread it out. Mine didn't work. Mine turned into a disaster. I don't want to go into detail about it, but I wanted some moss rocks to actually put in my fern gardens out of my house, and it didn't work. One option you can do is take it up, put it on different things and wet it down or put it next to it. Because remember, those spores literally, when they come out and they bring these lines out and they literally have these spores that will hit the rocks or hit something that you want to grow on, and they basically will be able to adhere to it. The key to it is make sure it's a moist area. There shouldn't be a problem with that.
Okay, great. Next question is do you recommend Leucothe for a woodland garden?
Lakothiwi?
Leucothe,
Oh
Leucothea.
yes, oh definitely. There is a variety of that called coastal, which is a native one. Um, those plants do extremely well in shade. I have seen them underneath a watering system where they do extremely well, but they can adapt to the cold. I mean to the dry. One of the neat things about that plant, it is an evergreen, but during the winter time all the leaves on it turn into a dark burgundy color. There is one out there that's called Rainbow, which is a variegated one that comes out with some really neat reddish looking new growth on them, like most of them do. But the variegation can hold in deep shade. So that's definitely a plant to use. It grows naturally in the woods. So it does do very well.
Perfect. Perfect. Uh, we only have two more questions, just a heads up. The second to last one is: are there any grasses which are good for a shade garden?
Definitely. One of them is the Japanese forest grass. And that's the one I showed two slides on that. It looks like a C. It kind of goes like this. And it is a clumper, so it does get bigger every year. It doesn't send out shoots. That one does extremely well in shade gardens. The neat thing about that one is it comes in a pure green. It also comes in a like a limey green, and then it comes in a yellow form as well. The neat thing about that type of grass is it tends to be very light. So even when you have a very, very slight breeze, you can get movements in a garden. The other thing about that type of grass is if you put amoebas of it in, it actually can connect a garden very well. And again, it almost looks like waves when you have it in a big clump. Another one is called carex grass. Carex grass is a evergreen, meaning that it literally is something that will keep its leaves green and during the wintertime. It's also a clumper, but it's a more traditional, come from the middle and kind of clumps out from there. And it does get bigger over time. There's all sorts of different varieties of that one. And it can get quite large over time. And then there's one that's called a chorus grass. That one actually it's almost like fans. The grass comes out like in flatness like this, and you have all the grass coming out. Then you have another one that comes like this. You have another one that comes like that. That one does tend to like a little bit of moisture. If you do have a moist garden, that would be a great place for that plant. The other thing about it is that one does very well in pots, and it's always a good complement to some of the other types of perennials that you can put in there that are deciduous, because that one literally will take over the show during the wintertime. So those three grasses, also the mondo grass. There's a dwarf mondo grass that is very, very short that loves the shade. But that one will teach you patience. It actually is a runner, but it's a slow runner. It takes a long time to move out from this area. A lot of people use that between stones as a filler around that sort of scenario. And then you also have the mondo grass that's longer. And that one, be very, very careful because that will take over the world for you. And then there's also liriope. That's almost like a grass that does very well in the shade.
Perfect. Just a few more, actually, a couple people. Before I go to the one that I was going to go to, someone had chimed in with a question about can you divide the Japanese forest grass?
Okay, so we have something out there that's making noise. Can you say that
I
again?
know. Uh, um, can you divide Japanese forest grass?
Yes. Once you get a
Yes.
big enough clump, you can divide it, move those clumps to another place, plant it, and then they'll start to go. A lot of the clumping perennials, you can basically divide it. Like the hostas, you can divide those. You can divide the Japanese forest grass. There's all sorts of different clumpers that you can divide for sure.
Perfect. All right. And then the last one that we have for today is the New York fern. Was that one, would you classify that as a runner as well?
Oh my God. Okay, so when I go out hiking in the woods, I see that fern everywhere. It's in New York and it's a runner. It will send out a root, and along that root, it will have all these fronds going up. And then in the fall, it turns into a bright yellow, and then it sinks to the ground, and then in springtime, it explodes again. There's another one that's called a hay-scent fern, which is another native. The reason why it's called a hay-scent fern is if you walk by it and you snap one of the branches on it, it smells like straw, which is really neat. That's another one that will take over very easily. It's a very aggressive plant. It's a native, so it can't be invasive. It's designed to go along, banks and washed out areas that are moist. It will take over the area to save the soil. So it does, it's very, very aggressive. That one too uh, turns into yellow in the fall and basically it dies to the ground and then comes back up in the spring.
Great. Well, that is all the questions that we have for right now. There was one person that was asking about a plant list. I can get with Louis to see if we can get a plant list out for you. Um, but so thank you everybody for joining us today. We are almost at time. We really enjoyed all of the information that you had for us today, Louis, and hopefully, if any of you guys are so inspired, feel free to give us a call or come on in and talk with us. Like Louis said, he's here most of the time and would love to talk to you about your gardens and
Oh,
give you some
yeah.
options.
Bring in some photographs. I would love, I mean, that's one thing I love to do. I love design. So if you have a woods, definitely come in and we can, I can design from this end. Sometimes they let me out, but most often they don't.
Well, great. Um, well, everybody, thank you so much for being with us today. We've loved having you. Keep a lookout on our website for our next webinar. It should be Sally that's doing the hosting next time with me behind the camera, as it normally is. But thank you guys for being here. And until next time, have a great day. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.